Hi, welcome to my tutorial on baking from high poly objects to low poly objects. I'm going to be covering three major things: smoothing groups, UVs, and cages that are essential to understand for getting a technically perfect bake. Alright, first let's really quick just recap the very basics of normal maps. So I'm here in Maya and I have a simple plane with a normal map applied to make it look like there is a spherical shape protruding from the shape, but actually it's just a plane, and that's what happens when I turn the normal map off. So if we go into Photoshop and look at this normal map, it's primarily a purplish blue kind of color with these green and red variations, and that's because the normal map stores the directional information in each of the channels. And the easiest way to imagine this is imagine that the red channel is what the object would look like being lit perfectly from the right. The green channel is what the object would look like if it was being lit perfectly from the top. And the blue channel is what the object would look like if it's being lit perfectly from the front, straight on. There is one important caveat though with the green channel. Different software will use the green channel either being lit from the top, or it will want it to be used being lit perfectly from the bottom. So Maya uses it from the top, but UDK, for example, will want the normal map, the green channel, to be flipped. And depending on how you create your normal map, there are usually options in that program in order to flip the green channel. Otherwise, you can do it in Photoshop. So that is really important to keep in mind. Alright, so now let's start baking. I'm going to be using Maya for creating the geometry, both the high definition and low definition meshes, but I'm going to be using XNormal in order to do the baking because it tends to bake a lot faster. So right now I have a very simple setup. I just have a normal cube that you just make from the primitives menu, and then I have a smoothed version of that cube with nice smooth edges. And I want to transfer the detail of this and these edges onto this cube. So the first thing you'll want to do is make sure that both meshes are overlapping. And there's a lot of confusion as to whether the high poly should be bigger or smaller than the low poly mesh. It really doesn't matter, except that what you want to keep in mind is you want as small of a difference as possible between the two, because the larger the difference is, the more inaccurate the rays have a chance to become between the low poly and the high poly, as a quick way of explaining. Alright, so when it comes to baking, I think there's three main really important things to keep in mind that I'm just going to call the three pillars of baking. And those are smoothing groups, UVs, and cages. And those are all actually equally important in getting a technically accurate bake. So I'm going to go through each of those and show you the wrong way and the right way to utilize these in order to get a good bake. Now, Maya users know smoothing groups as hard or soft edges. So basically, when you have a hard edge, you're separating smoothing groups, but when you have a soft edge, you have a continuous smoothing group. And Maya just considers this hard and soft edges. So it's basically conventional wisdom when you're doing a bake to soften all of the edges. So go to normals, soften edge, and then you have a much softer looking cube, even though the geometry is the same. It's just that the calculation the computer uses between faces is being averaged instead of cutting it off on that edge. Now this is actually a bad idea for hard surface objects. It's good for organic things like characters, but if we want to bake this cube, having all of these soft edges is actually a really bad idea. But I'm going to go through and bake it like this to show you what the problem is. First I'm going to export the low poly, but first there are three things you want to do with both the low poly and the high poly before you export them. First you want to make sure that the pivot is at the origin of the grid, and the way to do that is by hitting insert and then holding X, and you can snap the pivot to any grid point. you'll want that just to be in the very center of the grid. The second thing you want to do is make sure that you have history deleted, and you can do that by going to Edit, Delete by Type, History with the object selected. And the third thing you'll want to do is freeze transformation so that all of the translations, rotations, scale, everything is zeroed out. And to do that, you can go to Modify Freeze Transformations. So basically now what you see is what you get. And you want to do this for both objects so that when you bring them into XNormal, they're still located in the exact same location that they were in Maya without any other details getting in the way. Alright, so now I'm going to go to File, Export Selection with the low poly selected. Call that cube low. I already saved it out, but I'll do it again. And then you're going to want to do the exact same thing for the high poly. So grab my high poly, edit, delete by type, history, modify, freeze transformations, file, export selection, cube, high. So now let's open up XNormal and right click under high definition, add meshes, cube high, click on low definition, right click, add meshes, cube low, baking options, set my path that I want the normal map to bake to, make sure that the only thing checked here is normal map. I'm going to do 1024 just to speed things up. Under the normal map settings, there's this dot 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 for the settings. It shows X plus, Y plus, and Z plus. What I said earlier about the green channel, that's actually considered Y. If you're going to bake directly into UDK, you'll want to change Y plus to Y negative, and that's going to invert that channel so that UDK can read it correctly. For now though, we're going to be previewing in Maya, so I'm going to keep that at Y plus. But again, if you're going into UDK, you definitely want to put that at Y negative. I'm also going to choose tangent space because that's the type of normal map we're pretty much always going to be using for games, so make sure that that stays checked. And then everything else looks good, so I'm going to just click Generate Maps. And that was pretty quick, got my result. Let's select the low poly, and I'll just single that out so we can see better. And I'm going to create a new material in the hypershade, so let's just go with Phong, so that we can see the specular reflection. And then I'm going to go over here into the settings, let me drag this over, and go down to bump mapping, and this is actually where you import the normal map in Maya to preview. Then I'll choose File, and change this Use As to Tangent Space Normals. And then change the bump value to be the actual file that you're going to be using. And then apply that by middle mouse dragging onto here, and I'll turn on texturing, and of course you have to be in high quality rendering or viewpoint 2.0 in order to see the results. So right away you should notice something a little weird about this. For the most part it looks pretty smooth, but there's these weird kind of blotchy areas. It looks almost like it's curving in on the sides, and this is because what happened is we smoothed all of these edges, we made them soft, and so the normal map has to compensate for that smoothing because by default, the engine wants to make this part, facing the camera, and it wants to make this part dark like it's facing away from the camera. The normal map has to do a lot of work to compensate, and sometimes between the different ways different programs read normal maps, there's a slight difference, so you're never going to get something perfect. And in this case, it's actually a pretty bad result. You get a lot of ugly indentations. So this is where the first pillar of baking, smoothing groups, applies. And the basic idea behind the way you actually want to set up smoothing groups is that you want the low poly to be as close to the high poly as possible when it comes to these hard and soft edges. So wherever there's going to be something that's a 90 or 80 degree angle that would normally read as a pretty hard surface, you're going to want to make that a hard edge usually. So let's go back and harden these edges and try baking that again and see what happens. So now I'm going to re-export this. So again, edit, delete by type history, file, export selection. I'm just going to overwrite Q below, and then jump back into XNormal. And then I'm just going to leave everything the same, just hit generate maps again, and overwrite that old normal map. Alright, so now the problem we had before looks completely fixed. These sides actually look pretty smooth, but now we have another problem, and these corners just look awful. But if we look closely, there's actually two different problems going on with these corners. The first is that some of these, or all the corners rather, look like they're curving in, like dipping in and then back out. And see, that's happening with every corner. But then there's another problem that's happening with about half of the corners, and that's this really bad, ugly black line that's going through. And these are two entirely different problems, and I'm going to cover how to fix both of those. Alright, so first let's focus on these black lines that are happening on about half of the edges. So to illustrate the problem, I'm actually going to go through and just select every edge where this problem is happening. So there's one, there's one, there's one. That one looks pretty good. I'm just looking for black lines right now. So that one looks pretty bad, and that one looks pretty bad. And that's about the only ones that are showing those black lines. So now if I actually open up my UV editor and look at the edges I just selected, you'll see that all of the edges showing those black lines are the ones that are touching and sewn to other edges. Now the reason this is happening is because the normal map is actually bleeding over in between these edges, and there's really no way to fix this, especially when you're dealing with a game engine where the texture is going to get blurred and bitmapped and just compressed. There's always going to be this problem with the normals from one of these faces bleeding into the normals of another face, and whenever they do that, because these are hard edges, so this is a completely different normal, a completely different smoothing group than this, if they bleed into each other's spaces, they're just going to give a very bad result, and that's what's happening here. Is these pixels are actually supposed to be on this side, but because of compression or because of the resolution of the texture, there's just going to be this black line. And of course we can't make every texture enormous, so there's actually a very simple fix for this, and that just involves going back into your UVs and cutting all of these edges and making sure that there is a space wherever there is a hard edge. And this applies for all baking. Whenever you have a hard edge in a bake, you need to make sure that none of those hard edges are sewn together. They all have to be separated, or else you will get that bad black line issue. And I think that's the root of why a lot of people think that you can't bake with hard edges, but you can. You just need to make sure that these UVs the edges are separated everywhere. So I'm just going to cut those edges, and I'm just going to space these guys out to make sure that none of those are touching. Of course, optimal UVs would be a little bigger than this and take up more of the space, but this is just an example, so who cares? Alright, so for the sake of example, this is the result we want. All of these hard edges are separated, so nothing's going to bleed into each other now. And obviously nothing's going to match over here anymore, so I'm just going to turn that off for now. And again, we have to export this low poly with its new UVs in order for XNormal to bake the new results. So I'm going to delete the history again, and File, Export Selection, overwrite the low poly again, and bring that back into XNormal. I'm just going to hit Generate Maps again, overwrite the other normal map again, and when we bring that back in and turn it on, we'll see that those bad black lines are all gone. So the only issue we're left to deal with are these obnoxious kind of reverse bevels almost. They're just dipping into all the corners and making it look like it's a puffed out shape. And this is going to bring me into the third pillar of baking, which is cages. And the way cages work will explain perfectly why we're getting this result that we are. So what are cages and what do they do? Basically, cages are larger versions of your low poly object that encompass both the low poly and the high poly. And the easiest way to make one is to duplicate your low poly and then apply a transparent texture to it so you can see what's going on underneath. So then you're going to select all of the verts for that cage, and then go under Move Settings, click on Normal, and this only works with vert selected, and then you're going to drag this yellow N outwards, but first you want to make sure that you can see both your low poly and your high poly underneath, and you want the cage to only barely cover the high poly with nothing outside of the cage, but you don't want to go any further than that. So the way cages work is they change the way that XNormal shoots rays out of the low poly in order to search for the high poly. If you don't have a cage, what'll actually happen is the rays will shoot out completely perpendicular to each of the faces. So imagine we're looking at a cube from the side and we're just looking at one of the corners. These rays are getting shot completely perpendicular to these faces, but what happens is we find this big blank area in between both of those faces. And what a cage will do is it will average those rays so that it will shoot a ray in the direction of that corner. So if I overlay an imaginary high poly object, regardless of whether it's inside or outside of the low poly, you can see what's happening really clearly in this image. So when the rays are getting shot to each side, if the low poly is or the high poly is bigger, you're going to completely miss this corner, and you'll probably just get a very slight curve or a completely square shape with that kind of barely dipped look over on the side. On the other hand, what we're kind of getting is a smaller shape where these rays actually shoot backwards the same way they shoot forwards, and this ray is actually catching all of the corner all the way up to here, and the other ray is catching all the corner all the way up to there, so we're getting double corners. We're getting the whole corner on one side of the mesh and the whole corner on the other side of the mesh. What happens when you use a cage, though, is that you solve both of these problems because you do get rays shooting in the correct directions. So that's why a cage is important. It allows you to get those corners. So in order to use a cage, all you have to do is, like anything else, export it. So I'm going to delete by type history, file, export selection. I'm going to call it cube cage, and then go into XNormal. Quickly save that. And the way to use a cage in XNormal is to click on low definition meshes, and then make sure that you're scrolling down on the right mesh. You scroll over to this use cage button, and you're going to want to click that, and then you right click and go down to browse external cage file, and then once you do that, you want to select your cage, in this case cube cage, and it warns you that it has to have the exact same topology, which is true, or else it just won't work. So then I'm going to go back to baking options. Everything else is fine, so I'm going to bake one last time. I'll go back into Maya. Let's get that out of the way, and get that out of the way. And so here's our final result, and it's looking a lot better. Let me single that out. So we're going to get a slight edge here, and that's actually something that has to do more with the way each program reads normals a little differently. So you may never get a completely perfect result, but this is pretty good. And once the texture's on there, you're not going to notice anything wrong with that. The other reason this is happening is probably because, again, my UV layout wasn't optimal. Normally you'd want to obviously take advantage of the full space, especially since this is a 1024 map. I'm probably getting edges that aren't as clear as they should be. But in general, this is definitely the best way to bake hard edge objects in order to get good results. So great, I hope that answers a lot of the questions about how to bake and get good results. And I hope my explanations were understandable for how cages work and why they change how that edge looks. And if you have any other questions, just respond in the comments below, and I'll do my best to try to answer them, and maybe even make other videos. But I hope this has helped, so thanks for watching.